Good to see you again. How you doing? That was a good discussion. It was 1888. It was. Yeah, so it was during that. Deeply discouraged. And sort of.
Hi. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you back.
This is just all this attention begins to build.
We have people online.
Okay.
As is common in LA, people are probably saying, hey,
Right.
Driving or watching online. So do you want to
Give it
another minute or two, everyone?
Okay. Please, of course.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. We'll talk before.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much for coming out. If you might have heard, as is usual, a lot of people have decided they did not want to brave LA driving traffic, so they're online. We have a robust number of people online, and we are recording this, so we'll have this in perpetuity. But we're going to go ahead and begin. My name is Tyson Gaskell. I'm in charge of events for the USC libraries. And you may be wondering what I'm doing here, which is that we hold the archives for the Ruskin Art Club here in the USC libraries. The Ruskin Art Club is LA's oldest social club, dating back to 1888. And we got their archives about 10 years ago, and that was masterminded by the next gentleman who's going to be speaking, who is the executive director of the Ruskin Art Club, and that is my good friend and colleague, Gabriel Meyer. So Gabriel, please take it away.
Among Tyson's other signal responsibilities, if not accomplishments, is his being the president of the esteemed Ruskin Art Club. So
Carrying the lead.
that's it. That's right. Very, very good. Well, we're delighted to have you all here today for this annual Ruskin lecture at USC. Last year, we kind of interrupted the flow. Last year, we had a conference here, 2-day conference on Ruskin in America last year. So we felt that was enough for the fall of 2024. So we're now resuming the fall Ruskin lecture here at USC. This is our, I think, 25th annual Ruskin lecture here. I thought it's always dangerous to let the old man speak for himself, but I thought maybe we would start with a Ruskin quote. And as I say, this is always can always be a bit perilous, but worthwhile, worth the peril. This is from the very, very famous passage from related to our theme tonight, related from the Nature of Gothic, famous Nature of Gothic chapter in the Stones of Venice. We have much studied and much perfected of late the great civilized invention of the division of labor. Only we give it a false name. It is not, truly speaking, the labor that is divided, but the men. Divided into mere segments of men, broken into small fragments and crumbs of life, so that all the little pieces of intelligence that is left in a man is not enough to make a pin or a nail, but exhausts itself in making the point of a pin or the head of a nail. Now, it is a good and desirable thing, truly, to make many pins in a day, but if we could only see with what crystal sand their points were polished, sand of human soul, much to be magnified before it can be discerned for what it is, we should think that there might be some loss in it also. And the great cry that rises from all our manufacturing cities, louder than their furnace blast, is all in very deed for this, that we manufacture everything there except men. We blanch cotton and strengthen steel and refine sugar and shape pottery, but to brighten, to strengthen, to refine, or form a single living spirit never enters into our estimate of advantages. And all the evil to which that cry is urging our myriads can be met only in one way, not by teaching or preaching, for to teach them is but to show them their misery, and to preach to them, if we do nothing more than preach, is to mock at it. It can be met only by a right understanding on the part of all classes of what kinds of labor are good for men, raising them, making them happy, by a determined sacrifice of such convenience or beauty or cheapness as is to be got only by the degradation of the workman, and by equally determined demand for the products and results of healthy and ennobling labor. Well, we have been trying to bring Professor Tim Barringer to our shores here under the auspices of the Ruskin Art Club at USC for some time, and we have finally succeeded in luring him west. And we're delighted to have him with us. We've had quite a day already. We had a meeting with students with the Polymathic Academy here at USC this afternoon. It was very, very vigorous and long, actually. We were there much longer than we had expected to be. I first met Tim I think it was in 2019, when he came here to give a lecture for the Ruskin centennial year of Ruskin's birth at the Getty. And this was, I think it was a talk on
Why we need Ruskin.
Why we need Ruskin now. That's right, I remember that. That's great. That was wonderful. And then we also at on our Ruskin Art Club website, to put a little plug in for that, we have a resources tab, and on that tab there is some of Tim's work with the Unto This Last exhibition in 2019 at Yale, which is just wonderful. So all that material is available on our resources tab at the Ruskin Art Club website at www.ruskinartclub.org. Tim is Paul Mellon Professor of the History of Art at Yale University. His 2005 book, At Work, Art and Labor in Victorian Britain, a highly original study, I would say, was largely concerned with the writings of John Ruskin. He has published widely on the art of Britain and its empire, and on American landscape painting. He has co-curated many international loan exhibitions, including American Sublime in 2002, Art and Emancipation in Jamaica, 2007, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Avant-Garde in 2012, and Victorian Radicals in 2017. His writing on art and music have appeared in art history and in edited collections. See if anything else here. We are really delighted to have Tim with us today, and to have this discussion not only here but with our hopefully with our Zoom audience, with our digital audience. So without further ado, Tim Barringer.
Well, thank you very much, Gabriel, and thanks to Sarah as well, who played such a role in inviting me. It's an absolute delight to be here and to see the continuing endeavors of the Ruskin Art Club, which is a wonderful thing. I did want, before I started, to acknowledge that I can't say anything about Ruskin without thinking of the contributions of my former graduate students over the years, who've taken a graduate seminar on Ruskin, and really the conversations in that room have generated the ideas that you're going to hear today. And I particularly wanted to draw attention to what Gabriel just mentioned, which is the book Unto This Last, which was a catalogue really written by 3 senior grad students at Yale. Now, it's a good moral, because if you write a book on Ruskin, you get a job. They're all now gainfully employed, and but also I think, as it were, carrying the gospel of Ruskin to many different parts. I want to recognize Victoria Hepburn, Tara Contractor, and Judith Stapleton, because the conversations about that book and the Yale Center for British Art's willingness to let us do it and to put money behind it so that we could publish a book was really informative for the way I think about Ruskin. When I was last in LA to give the talk, Why We Need Ruskin Now, I wasn't imagining that I would be back 5 years later thinking we need Ruskin even more now than we did in 2019, but I suspect we do. So let me start with what is really the climax of any study of Ruskin. At the crux of all his thinking lies one sentence, a credo, laid out most vividly and simply in Unto This Last, as published in 1862. This is the peroration from the final essay, Ad Valorem, where he lays out one great fact. This was in the days when the word fact actually meant it's true. The one great fact clearly stated: there is no wealth but life. Life including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. With this simple statement, Ruskin fundamentally challenged the direction that Western society had taken for a century before his time and has taken since his time. in which wealth is calculated in financial terms, as capital, as property. He deliberately adopted the language of political economy, now known, of course, as economics, and naturalized into our world as common sense, in order to overturn its central tenet. The quality of life does not, he suggests, depend on a material standard of living. Rather, he offers a kind of parody of a familiar dictum simplified from the works of Jeremy Bentham, which runs something like, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." A statement that Bentham's liberal followers, and I use liberal in the 19th century sense of the word, tied solely to material prosperity. So the idea that the greatest happiness of the greatest number is really based in the wealth of the greatest number. Ruskin, who proclaimed himself to be an illiberal, not liberal at all, proposes that, quote, "that country is the richest which nourishes the greatest number of noble and happy human beings. That man is richest who, having perfected the functions of his own life to the utmost, has also the widest helpful influence, both personal and, by means of his possessions, over the lives of others." In our late capitalist age of cruel and unapologetic materialism, such sentiments may seem quaint. Yet Ruskin's invocation of great facts has never been more needed than they are today. And I want to explore tonight one aspect of that project, which is to propose that Ruskin's theory of value rests largely in questions of labor, interpreted in a broad and highly original fashion. Labor as a creative force, not as an economic necessity, but a creative force, an expression of character, of personality, of integrity. For Adam Smith, who we've already heard mentioned and invoked once, for Adam Smith, through the pin metaphor, which is from Smith's Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith linked the curse of Adam in the Bible to the logics of capitalism. Labor, therefore, is something you don't want to do, but you have to, in order to provide or obtain what Smith called the necessaries, the conveniences, and the amusements of human life. Do please take a seat. I've only just started. For John Stuart Mill, labor included, quote, "feelings of a disagreeable kind, bodily inconvenience or mental annoyance." And I'm sure we've all felt that on a Monday morning. But in Ruskin's view, labor is not about annoyance, inconvenience, and the disagreeable. For Ruskin, as for his mentor, Thomas Carlyle, the idea is that, in the quote I've just mentioned, that the man who works and has perfected the functions of his own life is a laborer, even if he's a philosopher, an artist, a craftsman, or a tradesman. All of those and all of those creative professions are forms of labor, defining forms, in fact, of labor. Now, of course, throughout all this literature in economics and in Ruskin's criticism, the pronoun is very strongly masculine. It's he who labors. And Ruskin did take a very different view of the work of women, though not perhaps so restrictive a view as some critics have suggested, and we can certainly talk about that at the end. Now, many of these ideas about labor are present as early as Volume 1 of Modern Painters, which is essentially a kind of late teenage project of Ruskin's, at least it's begun at that time. And this central move in Ruskin's thinking to put labor at the center of his project is a kind of metamorphosis of art history into radical social critique. By writing about paintings and buildings, as in the Stones of Venice, the buildings, Ruskin developed a theory of labor. This was, of course, the very moment he finished the second volume of, the first volume of Stones of Venice was finished in March and published in March 1851, and he was writing the second volume as the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park opened to the extraordinary spectacle of the great exhibition of the industry of all nations. This exhibition was a hymn to the machine, a hymn to the commodity and to global trade as a panacea, to possessions, to objects, to wealth as the accumulation of stuff. It also, of course, formed a ceremonial high altar of empire. So capitalism and empire coming together in this great display of 1851. Every form of labor was present, reified as things, but strangely, laboring bodies were largely absent from the exhibition's displays and from its politics, in spite of the fact that the official motto of the exhibition was, quote, "The workers of all types stand forth as the really great men." It was really, though, the products of their labor that were on show. And the central nave was just full of extraordinary, huge objects, some of them of absolutely no use whatsoever. However, these were the key displays at the Crystal Palace. And even though Ruskin insisted that we should turn our back on these displays, and William Morris, at the age of, I think, 17, refused to go in at all, being the precocious child that he was. But I do want to draw attention to one display, because it's going to be significant for my arguments tonight. And that is a display of metalwork, hardware from Sheffield, the traditional heart of the cutlery and domestic metalwork industries. These fireplaces here, from the Green Lane Works in Sheffield, were designed and manufactured by Hoole and Company, who had employed Alfred Stevens, a very significant figure in the world of English sculpture, to come and create, as it were, artistic products for Hoole's forge in Sheffield. And working with Alfred Stevens was a young designer called Godfrey Sykes, who will come into our story shortly. And there you get a close-up of these rather remarkable fireplaces. But I want, with Ruskin, temporarily at least, to turn our backs on the Crystal Palace, an emblem of modernity, and do what he did in the spring of 1851, to gaze with unparalleled intensity at the material traces of late medieval Venice. The time-ravaged masonry of Venice's Gothic buildings offered Ruskin's receptive eye and mind a radical new understanding of social and economic organization. He saw in the traces of the late medieval world an alternate set of possibilities for the nature of work and for the work of art. I say it that way rather than the work of art. It's the work that art does rather than the commodity itself. Rather than offering a mere architectural history, a formal chronicle of changing styles, which is probably what people thought they were going to buy when they bought the Stones of Venice, this book instead opens with an extraordinary declaration. Since first the dominion of men was asserted over the ocean, 3 thrones of mark beyond all others have been set upon its sands, the thrones of Tyre, Venice, and England. Of the first of these great powers, that's Tyre, only the memory remains. Of the second, Venice, the ruin. And the third, which inherits their greatness, so that's England, if it forgets their example, may be led through prouder eminence to less pitied destruction. Just imagine buying an architectural guidebook which actually tells you that you are living in a society which is hurtling towards catastrophe, and that, you know, it's your fault, essentially. That's basically page 1 of the Stones of Venice. Thus announced, Ruskin's project is gradually revealed to be a critical history of the rise and, in Ruskin's view, but not in the view of architectural history generally, the fall of Venetian architecture. and by a process mainly of implicit historical comparison, a fundamental critique of modern British society under industrial capitalism, a critique that resonates more powerfully today, perhaps, than it did in 1851. So although Ruskin aimed to record, as far as I may, the warning which seems to be uttered by every one of the fast gaining waves that beat like passing bells against the stones of Venice. So he's listening to the bells of Venice as a warning for Victorian England. I think it struggled for a while to dawn on his large readership that what he was really doing was asserting a connection between morality and architecture, between the quality of social life and that of aesthetic production. If you turn that around, reading aesthetic production will allow you to assess virtue, will allow you to assess what kind of society made this thing. Now, at the core of Ruskin's critique of periods when things go wrong historically, so later Venice and the place we live now, Victorian England, or indeed contemporary, Euro-American society in 2025, the problem, Ruskin tells us, in those places is a problem of labor. It's a problem of the quality of work. Now, of course, you can also say the quality of work when you're talking about a tabletop. So it's work as a process and work as a product. He presented a novel and penetrating account of this process, labor, the way in which human beings spend the bulk of their lives. And a central section of the second volume, written during 1851, celebrates the sculpture of the late medieval era, the Gothic, as a kind of reified form of healthy social relations, the vibrant culture, the noble work of hands and minds which produced it. Gothic carving represented the freedom of the men who made it. So by contrast, he's actually looking at literally the kinds of incisions in Gothic detail, the detail of Gothic carving as a manifestation of individual freedom, of liberty, and of creativity. And in Ruskin's scheme, Gothic carving represented the freedom of those who made it, in contrast to the cultures of antiquity, the Egyptian, the Greek, the Roman. These, of course, were exactly the cultures that were most admired, for example, in the displays of the British Museum at this time, that the origins of modern civilization, so your average museum goer would think. But in fact, for Ruskin, these ancient societies were already insistent on a machine-like regularity and perfection of labor. The art of an architecture of the classical world, Ruskin writes, was servile. It's not the material, marble or stone, it's the absence of human labor, the absence of this manifestation of individual freedom and fancy, which in the great monuments of classical antiquity is simply not there. This means, Ruskin said in no uncertain terms, that the workman was, in Greek and Roman systems, a slave with no imaginative freedom. By contrast, the medieval, or specifically the Christian system of ornament, I'm quoting, in that system, this slavery is done away with. Christianity having recognized, says Ruskin, in small things as well as great, the individual value of every soul. Now, of course, we must recognize an ethical problem in the use of the term slavery to define a kind of ethical issue in the past when slavery was an ethical issue still in the present. As Ruskin wrote, chattel slavery continued in the United States, though not in the British Empire. But I did want to draw a parallel with something that Ruskin may or may not have read, which is the posters that were pasted up all over London on April the 9th, or the week before April the 10th anyway, 1848, for the great Chartist demonstration, of which we have this extraordinary photograph, daguerreotyped, on the first images of a kind of mass demonstration, and interestingly enough in the Royal Collection. And this is the pronouncement to the working men of London. the press having misrepresented and vilified us and our intentions, well, that hasn't changed, has it? The demonstration committee consider it their duty to state that the grievances of the working class are deep and our demands just. We demand a fair day's wages for a fair day's work. We are the slaves of capital. So the language of enslavement is used as the most powerful metaphor for injustice. It's adopted from the anti-slavery movement and goes straight into the movement for, working class emancipation in the Chartists, but it's also used at the same time by Ruskin to describe his analysis of the ways in which the wrong kind of labor is creating a kind of dystopian industrial present. Back to the Crystal Palace, because in Ruskin's writing, this contrast between Gothic and classical worlds with our own suddenly rebounds on the Victorian reader with ferocity. And this is something we were talking about with the group of students at lunchtime. Because after many hundreds of pages of learned disquisition on Venetian history, the text of Stones of Venice suddenly abandons descriptive and analytical language and adopts a mode of address to the Victorian middle class, which is more typical of the political meeting or even the sermon. You might even think an evangelical sermon. Ruskin insists that the reader must look around this English room of yours. So you have to look up from your book and examine the room that you're sitting in. In other words, look at yourself through the material objects that you have collected. This contains, Ruskin tells you, accurate moldings and perfect polishings and unerring adjustments of the seasoned wood and tempered steel. This is the modern domestic environment of which you have been so proud. And I think the best representation of it is William Holman Hunt's painting, The Awakening Conscience, where you can see the polishings, the perfect steel, the modern table with all of its absolute, what might be thought of as the perfection of furniture making, the machine aesthetic of 1851. Ruskin tells you this is as bad as a Greek temple. It's as bad as you could get, because if, and I quote now a famous essay by your USC colleague Kate Flint, if read rightly, this interior will reveal the darkness at the heart of contemporary society. These perfectnesses, Ruskin says, are signs of a slavery in our England 1,000 times more bitter and degrading than that of the scourged African or helot Greek. And of course, Ruskin exaggerates. It is not worse than African slavery at all. But he's using that metaphor because it's the most powerful one that exists in the argot of the day. Men were not intended, he continues, and this speaks to the quotation that Gabriel read out so beautifully. Men were not intended to work with the accuracy of tools, to be precise and perfect in all their actions. If you will have that precision out of them and make their fingers measure degrees like cogwheels and their arms strike curves like compasses, you must unhumanize them. So Ruskin saw this dehumanizing labor in the industrial cities of England. And there are plenty of examples of that. This is a wonderful sort of panoramic view of the city of Manchester, which is where you would probably expect someone like Ruskin to turn, the largest industrial city in England with the textile mills, the most developed kind of mechanization of any city in England. But interestingly, he didn't turn to Manchester, didn't look at a vision like William Wilde's watercolor here shows us. He turned instead to the city of Sheffield. I'll come to this image in just a moment, but I want to talk to you a little bit, in fact, for the rest of this talk, about the city of Sheffield, a town that Ruskin came to know well. He actually did spend significant time there, and it became, in the end, the focus of his philanthropic activities. Now, the reason he was interested in Sheffield was iron. Sheffield was an iron and steel making town, particularly devoted to the creation of sharp blades and machine parts. So very specialized, skilled making of hard-edged tools. Although the prefabricated kind of components of a structure like the Crystal Palace were anathema to him, and even machinery itself seemed to portend a dark future, Ruskin did believe that handmade iron could be a thing both of use and beauty. And Judith Stapleton wrote a wonderful essay in our book, Unto This Last, on Ruskin and iron, pointing out that, in fact, a lot of his work, including the collection of essays, The Two Paths, and one of the essays in The Two Paths is The Work of Iron, actually gives a sense of the potential creative possibilities of the manipulation of iron if the labor that manipulates it is free and creative. These examples from Bellinzona and Verona were much beloved of him. And the reason that Ruskin was so interested in Sheffield is because, as Ruskin said, ironwork as an art is always necessary and useful to man, and English work in iron is masterful of its kind. So it's in this context that we should examine the Sheffield products, the saws, the knives, and the cast iron fireplaces that we saw proudly displayed at the Great Exhibition. These objects, these handmade Sheffield objects, stood at a precipice. Still largely made in small workshops by hand, these products or manufactures could seem to display the geometric precision of the machine, which the cogs and compasses that Ruskin so disavowed. But they could also be seen to continue an artisanal tradition which reaches right back to Bellinzona. So Sheffield is balanced between triumph and catastrophe in terms of Ruskin's theories of labor. So let me introduce you to Sheffield. I'm guessing that if you've been on holiday in the UK, Sheffield was not on your agenda, but maybe it should be. It's a Yorkshire town, and it's very different from the textile towns of Leeds, Bradford, Manchester, Halifax. And it's not even really like the engineering and metalwork hub of Birmingham, which was jewellery and machine parts were central to that. Let me read out a guidebook to Sheffield, a proud Yorkshire tribute to Sheffield and the surrounding area known as Hallamshire, written in 1819. I should do this in Yorkshire dialect, but I think I might not, even though I am Yorkshire born and bred. Nature has been beautiful. Nature has been bountiful to the people of Sheffield, not by bestowing upon it most delicious fruits, double harvests, or perpetual summer, but by giving it the means and materials of durable and substantial comforts, so placed as they may serve as the stimulants to labour. And accordingly, the sons of Sheffield are an active, acute, and hardy race, patient of toil, unwillingly submitting to unnecessary restraints, aware of the advantages of their situation, proud of the reputation they have obtained for her, attached to their birthplace, and wherever they go, remembering the sound of Sheffield's waters pouring over the slow-moving water wheel, the hiss of the grinding stone, and the sound of the forge. This is the 1819 edition of Hunter's Sheffield, and here is the frontispiece, which shows you a kind of mixture of the rural and the urban. You can see the forges are there, but they're sort of organically molded into the ecology of Sheffield with its fast-flowing water. The sights and sounds of this evocative vignette, the water pouring over a slow-moving water wheel, the hiss of the grinding stone, and the noise of the forge, date from the first half of the 19th century. But by the time Ruskin was writing in 1851, there were new sounds in Sheffield. The roar of the industrial blast furnace, the rhythmic pulse of the steam engine. And these two models of industrialization, craft versus mass production, were locked in competition in Sheffield in the Victorian era. And I think that's why Ruskin found it so fascinating. So a contrasting face of Victorian Sheffield can be seen in this lithograph made about 1850. This is land that in 1849, and I actually checked this out on a map, was completely rural farmland. So within 12 months, it had been absolutely transformed from this world of the rural past to this world of the kind of dystopian industrial future. This was the Sheffield that was being built while Ruskin was writing his text that I've just read to you. A dark gash runs across this image, throwing the hay cart and the characters in the foreground into a kind of theatrical relief, forming a threshold between two worlds. Beyond this visual caesura between past and present rises the Cyclops works of Savile Street at the eastern edge of Sheffield. The Cyclops works produced, I'm quoting now, cast, shear, spring, blister, and every available kind of steel. It made particularly components for the railway industry. And its main speciality was springs for locomotives, carriages, and wagons. It also produced something absolutely essential for bourgeois life in the 1850s. 5,000 tons of Sheffield steel a year were used to produce crinolines. Right. So these skirts were held up by Sheffield steel, the same steel that made the springs for a railway locomotive. So the Cyclops works makes a daunting presence in this lithograph, like the mythological giant from whom its name derives. The factory's wall is punctuated with blank eye sockets, revealing nothing of its interior world. And the doorway to the works here, these doorways open onto a seemingly empty space, almost as if this is an entirely automated world. There's nothing that we can learn about the labor that takes place in this factory. And that gets even more extreme when we look at what happened over the next 20 years, where that is the original front of the factory from here. But the whole thing has expanded so massively that it's obliterated all of this landscape. And it's now a kind of massive complex of mass production. But again, we can only see the tiniest ant-like little figures scuttling around in this kind of, is it a utopia of mass production or a dystopia of alienated labor? Camel's aggressive program of expansion saw the works just become massively greater by 1862 on the right than it had been a little earlier. So in this image, we look now from a kind of Archimedean point of vantage, beneath a canopy of plumes, we can just see that the division of labor is the key to this entire enterprise, that each one of these sheds does something different in the production process. And increasingly, there was a demand for unskilled labor to tend this kind of complex, rather than the skilled labor of the individual small workshops which had preceded it. So we've seen in just 20 years a transition from agriculture to factory system, peasant to proletarian, and from small-scale industry to massive division of labor. This was an industrial revolution in real time. And of course, in this building, this is where Ruskin's unhumanized men, whose fingers measure degrees like cogwheels and whose arms strike curves like compasses, were employed. So why on earth would Ruskin find any redemptive quality in this nightmarish steampunk techno dystopia of Sheffield? Well, the answer is that the processes of blade making those blades that were shown in the Crystal Palace, was still in the hands of individual small craftsmen who had, known as the little mesters, who had these small 18th century forges, and still the blades could not be made mass-produced in factories. So it's a significant point, I think, that the different stages of industrialization can all be seen at the same time in Sheffield. If we go back to a text from the 1860s, in dexterity of handling, rapidity of execution, perception of results, and honest zest, the small Hallamshire forger and grinder are unapproached by any foreign workman in the trade. So even in the 1850s, there was still tremendous pride in this craft labor, which was not done on a grand scale, but was done, and it says here in the 1843 Royal Commission report, Sheffield thrives as a result of very small cutlers who, with the assistance of a boy or two, perform all the operations needed for making of blades. These are the blades that, of course, were used for harvesting all around the British Empire, for cutting sugarcane and grass. So Ruskin admired these men, the ironworkers whose manual skills were exercised without reference to anything other than a sort of 18th century machinery. And interestingly, this is a tilt forge, which is a water wheel powered hammer, which is the exact same machine that you might remember from Joseph Wright of Derby's iron forge of 1770. So this is by now almost a century old. This is a century old technology, but it does the job, and it does the job without steam power. We're looking at a painting by the artist Godfrey Sykes, who was trained in the Sheffield School of Art and trained to admire the skills of the local hand craftsmen. So I should just explain, scythe blades were made of two metals. The core was fashioned from steel and the outside wrought iron. So the combination of the hard and very brittle steel allowed a sharp blade, but around the outside, the more malleable iron prevented breakage. So this was a very, very skilled craft. And it was the hands of this man moving the blade under the hammer that were the difference between a successful or unsuccessful blade. Couldn't be made in Cannell's Cyclops works. So just as Victorian rural scenes, the pre-Raphaelite landscapes, can never escape their unspoken other, which is the modern city, the railway, Ruskin's images of Venice are always haunted by the rising waters of the lagoon. So the factory overshadows this work, this kind of doomed, but at this time necessary craftsmanship of the artisan. And it's for this reason, I don't think it's quite been understood, that it was for this reason that Ruskin chose Sheffield. Also Turner had been there, which always helps, but he chose Sheffield as the place to locate his social experiment. There was a land scheme, which I'm not going to talk about, that's a more agrarian question, but I'm particularly interested in Ruskin's choice of the Sheffield working man, the Sheffield labourer, as the person who can be saved, the group of people for whom an educational institution is worth creating, because there's a redemptive possibility in this manual labour. And it was really here that he focused the attentions of the Utopian Guild of St. George. The guild, whose quixotic mixture of medieval mysticism and practical socialism will be well known to members of the Ruskin Art Club, it offered Ruskin's ultimate but utterly idiosyncratic solution to the problems of industrialization, labor, and poverty, poverty caused by property. It was a sort of neo-feudal futurism, the Guild of St. George. On the one hand, a round table of knights, and on the other hand, a kind of socialist or even anarchist manifesto for change. Ruskin was horrified by the Cyclops works, which he imagined being sort of imprinted on what had been this beautiful town when Turner visited it in 1799. He saw works on that scale as both aesthetically and socially evil, proposing instead a kind of quasi-monastic communitarian utopia. The Guild was a company, but not a company like the East India Company or Charles Cannell's Limited Company. It was a company like Mallory might have used it in the Morte d'Arthur to describe a group of knights, a flagrantly archaic challenge to the notion of the joint stock company or corporation, paradigmatic mid-Victorian economic structure. The Guild of St. George was influenced by Thomas More's Utopia and is kind of staging house between Thomas More and William Morris's News from Nowhere, 1891. The Guild was symbolic, but it was also practical. It was a demonstration of intent, but it also actually was intending to change people's lives. And as you read through descriptions and discussions of the Guild in the brilliant, wildly eccentric letters to the workmen and labourers of Great Britain, which Ruskin fitfully produced 1871 to 8, 1880, 1883, as a Fors Clavigera, you could see how the concept of the Guild gradually emerged and was refined. So, although he ostensibly addressed respectable working men with this newsletter, his actual readership was far more privileged and eclectic. For example, who could understand this title, Fors Clavigera? It's really obscure. It sort of means fortune bearing the nail. Fors stands for the force of wise and strong men doing good work. The idea is men doing good work with iron, which of course takes us back to Sheffield. The iron nail then is really not far from the work of the Sheffield cutler. And indeed, Ruskin wrote, "I am now frequently asked why I chose Sheffield for it, rather than any other town. And the answer is a simple one, that I acknowledge iron work as an art always necessary and useful to man. And English work in iron, I think I quoted this before, is masterful in its kind." And Ruskin continued, "Not only for this reason, however, but because Sheffield is in Yorkshire," thank you, Ruskin, Yorkshire, and yet in the main temper of its inhabitants, it is Old English, and therefore capable of the ideas of honesty and piety by which Old England lived. So somehow Sheffield is resisting turning into Manchester or, Cottonopolis. It's still Old England. And finally, because Yorkshire is within easy reach of beautiful natural scenery and the best of English lands, and at Lincoln, York, Durham, Selby, Fountains, Bolton and Furness are cathedrals and abbeys which manifest the English Gothic at its best. Which gives me an opportunity to bring in the slides of Bolton Abbey, which I include in every lecture. Shannon has been there and seen it. But these were the kind of buildings that Ruskin felt that, a short train ride from Sheffield now, the working men could go and look at as sort of paradigms of beauty, either the beauty of a Gothic arch or the beauty of a natural arch within the landscape surrounding these Gothic buildings. So there was redemption at stake. The picturesque virtues of the Old English workman also applied to the Old English landscape and the Old English architecture. And indeed, this, quite interestingly, is a pre-Raphaelite painting of Bolton Abbey made by John William Inchbold from nearby Leeds, who's, as it were, exploring a Ruskinian reading of this building, how you can explore the carving of a Gothic structure and bring out the connections between the ancient English Gothic and English vegetation. The whole package is available. The most visible and ultimately the most successful aspect of Ruskin's work in Sheffield was the museum at Walkley in Nether Hallam, on the outskirts of the city. All Ruskin wanted for his museum was a room with good light, anywhere accessible to the men who were likely to come to it. So he bought a stone-built, well, they call it a cottage. It's actually quite a nice detached house, but anyway, they called it a stone-built cottage, typical of the region about Sheffield, was purchased for £600 and became the museum's first home. Ruskin was able to bring together here a teaching collection of objects which his earlier work gave him unique authority to discuss: medieval and Renaissance art, landscape paintings, drawings and prints, geological specimens, and natural history specimens. And these were mixed together in a way so as to encourage the eye of the local Sheffield workman to embrace the kinds of visual tradition that Ruskin approved of. So these are plaster casts of Gothic ornament and photographs of Italian, this is a church in Pisa, Santa Maria della Spina. The idea is that the eye would be sort of led around to make associations, which could then be taken back into the making of ironwork to turn Sheffield into a kind of Bellinzona of the 19th century. Venice was particularly important in these displays. John Walton Bunny's great painting of Venice was commissioned specially. Bunny was sent by Ruskin to paint St. Mark's Cathedral and bring the painting back to show to the metal workers of Sheffield in this museum. And I just wanted to say that under this last exhibition at Yale, Judith and Victoria and Tara specifically reconstructed this same kind of display. We managed to find some plaster casts from Venice, drawings from Venice by Ruskin, and then a collection of the minerals from the Yale Peabody Museum, some of which were associated with Ruskin's collections, medieval manuscripts, early printed books, and so on. To bring together the same kind of collection of objects, to teach the eye and to extend the beauties of ironwork rather than turning it into pins made by a division of labor. So particularly significant were traces of the hands of earlier laborers. That's why the plaster casts were so significant and the Bunny painting of the facade of St. Mark's. Now, in Fors Clavigera, Ruskin professed himself to be, quote, ready to arrange such a museum for the artisans of Sheffield as they have not yet dreamed of. Not dazzling, not overwhelming, but comfortable, useful, and in such a sort as a smoke-encumbered sky will admit, beautiful, though not on the outside otherwise decorated than with plain and easily worked slabs of Derbyshire marble, with which I shall face the walls in order to make a working man's Bodleian library. So this little tiny space at Walkley was the exact opposite, the inverse of the South Kensington Museum in London, which continued the logics of the 1851 exhibition, a massive omnium gatherum of colonial loot and materials gathered for the purposes of improving the profitability of mechanized industry. Henry Cole's South Kensington Museum, the first capitalist museum in the world. John Ruskin's museum, the first anti-capitalist museum in the world. A kind of, it's almost like a provocation. The extreme difference between the facades gives it all away. And location was absolutely critical. Ruskin had the idea of looking at the industrial town from the outside. I'm sorry, I'll come back to those in a second. And luring the workmen out of the industrial town to the kind of vantage points from which Turner had painted, for example, Leeds in 1816 or Sheffield a little earlier. And it's quite intriguing, I think, just going back to the South Kensington Museum, to note the kind of gap in the middle here, which might be occupied by someone like Godfrey Sykes, who was actually trained in Sheffield and could have become one of the people whose Ruskin's ideas had manifested itself through, but it was actually brought down to South Kensington and became the designer of this facade. So this facade is designed by Godfrey Sykes of Sheffield, but it's in London and it's serving the great energies of capitalism. Intriguingly, if you go to Sheffield, you'll find that one of these pillars was sent back to Sheffield as a memorial when Godfrey Sykes died of overwork, having killed himself, creating this, literally killed himself, creating this building. So it's a sort of ironic exchange here. And here is Godfrey Sykes, A for artist, self-portrait of Godfrey Sykes. And here he is with Henry Cole and Captain Falk, who was the designer of the South Kensington Museum. One case in point of a workman who actually was, as it were, was affected by Ruskin's museum in Sheffield was Benjamin Freswick, a young grinder, so a knife grinder who then made his living by sharpening knives on a moving stone circle. He strolled one Sunday afternoon into the museum and had a conversation with the curator, Mr. Henry Swan, well-known eccentric. And the spark was quickened, Ruskin says, and the grinder became a sculptor. Creswick made a head of Ruskin, which Ruskin, I think, slightly pushing critical belief, said was at least as good as Thorvaldsen and Canova. Well, okay. Anyway, but as Ruskin, it's a rash declaration, but it does have a kind of integrity, a sort of Gothic integrity, if you like, which befits its origins. And encouraged by Ruskin, Benjamin Creswick, the knife grinder, went on to produce a really rugged relief of course, the blacksmith's forge, the scene of a labor as creative, as expressive, as a non-industrial actor, so the village blacksmith. But his masterpiece is slightly more ideologically complex because here it is. This is the frieze for the London headquarters of the Worshipful Company of Cutlers, so one of the old London guilds, made in 1887, a scene in terracotta, which offers a kind of catalogue of the full range of artisanal skills of Sheffield's working class. Here, for example, is the knife grinder going on. It's also made in a style which is clearly reminiscent of the relief sculptures of the 15th century. So something like a Donatello relief sculpture. Not everyone was persuaded, I have to say, by Ruskin's evangelical mission in Sheffield. For example, the magazine Fun in 1876 ran a comic illustration entitled Playing with Edged Tools. So sharp blades, of course, being Sheffield's most famous product. And the caption, I don't know if you can read it from where you're sitting, an undeserved snub for Sheffield. Mr. Fun cannot help thinking that there is more in good in a day's honest labour than in years of superfine, often superficial criticism. So Ruskin is presented here in the outfit of a high Anglican clergyman with, I think it says Saint Rusty, which I rather like around here. It's hard to read. Obviously, he's behind him is the storm cloud of the 19th century about which he was about to write. But in it is not so much the dead men's souls of those killed by the industrial pollution as the rebellious Sheffield workers of the 1860s. And this takes us to a very specific history because there was a very, very dramatic pattern of violence between workers and employers, which Engels characterized as the social war in Sheffield, which rages unchecked. In 1867, a year after Godfrey Sykes's death and just before Ruskin started his campaign in Sheffield, an assassination attempt was made on William Tyzack, the manager of the Abbeydale Forge since 1849, which led to a major government inquiry into the Sheffield outrages. So Sheffield Labour takes on a more demonic appearance in this particular caricature. But Ruskin was not deterred. He sponsored the land scheme that I've mentioned, promoting a return to natural farming methods in a sort of quasi-feudal society. It didn't work out, didn't last long. But the natural landscape of Sheffield was what continued to make him excited about this place. So even more dramatic was the contrast than in Leeds that we looked at, was the contrast between this world of Sheffield Attercliffe and then the beauties of the local Peak District hills. And I want to use as my last image this one, because Ruskin had insisted that in the land settlement outside Sheffield, no machines moved by artificial power shall be used on the estates of the Guild of St. George. Wind, water, and animal force may be the only motive powers employed, and there will be as little trade or importation as possible. It's a kind of primitivistic harking back to a past method of agriculture. It's rather like Thomas Carlyle's description of the monastic lands as they were cultivated in the Middle Ages in his book Past and Present. And indeed, Ruskin said the guild should be monastic in its principles of labor, that is, giving labor to the commune or to God rather than using it for profit or wages. Skilled work on the land, the land settlement would be respected. The carpenter and the smith must be trained to the perfectest work, and they are to be employed on the parts and that of the houses and implements to which finish is essential to strength. But if it's not essential to strength, then we do not have perfect polishings and all those characteristics of Victorian furniture. In a way, Ruskin actually wanted to reverse the trajectory of this image, to move not towards industry from agriculture, but away from industry back into agriculture. That's why the museum and the land settlement plan were intimately connected to each other. And intriguingly, in Fors Clavigera, Ruskin warned what will happen if capitalism is allowed to run unchecked. And the reason I use this watercolor from the Yale Center for British Arts collection is because this mountain in the Yorkshire Dales is called Ingleborough. And you pass it on the way up to Brantwood, to Ruskin's house in the Lake District. Ruskin wrote an extraordinary text called Looking Down from Ingleborough, in which he reflected on these histories of agriculture to industry, small industry to large industry, and his wish to reverse those historical trends, to return to a kind of honest agricultural monastic life. In this text, Looking Down from Ingleborough, Ruskin writes, if all the money of all the capitalists in all the world were destroyed, and if all the machines and apparatus of manufactures were crushed by a mistake in signals. Anyone who's been on a train in Britain knows just how disastrous a mistake in signals can be. In one catastrophe, and nothing remained but the land with its animals and vegetables and buildings for shelter. The poorer population of this land would be very little worse off than they are at this instant. And their labor, instead of being limited by the destruction, would be greatly stimulated. So for working men, if the entire industrial order was destroyed, Ruskin said, life would be better to be back down here in the world as it once was before. If you stand on the top of Ingleborough, though, he was imagining you could look the other way to see this industrial world which has been completely destroyed by an apocalyptic upheaval. But he doesn't leave it there, because this is Ruskin. He always has to twist the knife just one more time. This is what happens after that catastrophe, when everything has returned to a kind of agrarian utopia. They would feed themselves from the animals and from the growing crops, and then start to heap here and there a few tons of ironstone, start to build walls around them to get a blast, and in a fortnight they would have iron tools again and be fighting just as usual. Yeah. So the entire process of world history would repeat itself, but in 2 weeks after the... So this is not news from nowhere. This is a kind of repeat dystopia that Ruskin imagined. Even a catastrophe would not shake the foundations of society, because at the core of the aesthetic and cultural revolution which Ruskin dreamed might begin among the active, acute, and hardy workmen of Sheffield lay the transformation of work itself from drudgery to creativity, from an exercise in self-interest and exploitation to the contribution to a common good. Of course, that transformation seems further away now than it did perhaps among the Sheffield ironworkers of Ruskin's time. Yet it has never been clearer than it is today that as a global system, the intense materialism of our present is catastrophic both to environment and to society. There is then, indeed, no wealth but life, including all its powers of love, joy, and of admiration. And although the triumph of labor, as imagined by Walter Crane, did not result from Ruskin's investigations and experiments in Sheffield, I think that we should take them very, very seriously, not only in his time, but also in ours. Thank you. I'm very happy to take any comments, questions. Yes, Amy.
Thank you so much. So fun. Had great images, of course. I really just want to know more about Alfred Stevens and his
No, I'm done.
you dangle that. So I'm just going to invite you to. Can you talk us through? Were they cast iron? Were they wrought iron?
They were cast iron. So Alfred Stevens, who is the sculptor of the Wellington Memorial, which was never quite finished in St. Paul's Cathedral, was a kind of neo-Renaissance sculptor. He was trying to be a new Michelangelo for England, a dodgy scheme. But he was much admired by Henry Cole of the South Kensington Museum. And he was also one of the very few fine art sculptors who was prepared to move across from the studio into the workshop to do commercial work and then back again. So he was hired by Hoole of Sheffield to essentially do what the Great Exhibition said should be done, which is that fine art should make product design better. So you get the best fine artists, you bring them to Sheffield and you leave them there. Of course, it was a complete disaster because he had no sense of the production processes, which is where the local students, Godfrey Sykes and a couple of others, Reuben Townrow, they all ended up in London, but they were in Sheffield at the School of Art, working with Stevens to try and turn these crazy designs into a fireplace, rather than a sort of Baroque sculptural ornament. So it was part of the kind of, in a larger version of this, I would run Ruskin's sort of project alongside Henry Cole's project. And it's so fascinating. They're both happening in Sheffield at the same time. And so Alfred Stevens is saying, use art to make mass production more effective. And Ruskin's saying, get rid of mass production and bring back art. And then, did they ever have dinner together? I think actually Stevens was gone before Ruskin arrived, but in the same 20-year period, this was all happening. So I think it's a really fascinating question about how you navigate the intersection between art and industry. Mm-hmm. And Cole is saying, just take gestures from art and apply them to the applied arts, he called it. So you apply them, you bolt them onto products, and you sell stuff made in industrial factories. And Ruskin is saying, it's not the style. Style doesn't matter. It does, but this is not the question. The question is the quality of life of the person who made it. And that's the only thing that will guarantee good quality productions. So, some of Ruskin's language about South Kensington is extraordinary. The system of abortion of Mr. Henry Cole is really vicious because he realized that Cole was putting a kind of a glaze, a varnish of artistic respectability over a fundamentally, according to Ruskin, rotten mode of production. There is a new book on Alfred Stevens, which says almost nothing about
well, and Ruskin was really against cast iron. I mean, that was right.
Yes, exactly.
That was like that.
Yes, it was. Yes, indeed. I mean, I think you could argue that the Green Lane products were so hand tooled after they'd been cast that each one is slightly different. I mean, there are some in the V&A now, and they are formidable. But I can't imagine anyone having one actually in their home. It's like having a small piece of St. Peter's Cathedral in your living room. So they nobody bought. Yes, please.
Thanks for a fantastic talk. You mentioned it a little bit in passing at the end in your quotation about, the whole world sort of fell into the past and then the iron ore were heaped up. And
Yes.
then- So I was curious about that because I was wanting to know about earlier in the supply chain. Does Ruskin ever comment on like the miners or, you know, the actual extraction of material that then gets and worked into the.
It's a good question, and Ruskin comments on everything. So I'm sure if you went to volume 39 of Cook and Wedderburn, you could look under mining and you'd find what he doesn't do is make it a central part of his argument. So, you know, a key concept for us now is extraction. But for Ruskin, I just don't think that. I think he was interested in the geology of a place to be sure that what gets built above the ground reflects the kind of structures under the ground. I don't know, and I stand to be corrected, that he said too much about the life of miners, who of course were, you know, living in appalling conditions. And Ruskin wasn't interested in things like regulations to make mines more safe. He just simply didn't believe in the kind of liberal interventionist model. He just wasn't, that wasn't part of his plan. I think he probably thought that if you just don't go down that deep, you know, you dig in the way that they dug in the Middle Ages, you'll be fine. And I suspect that that's not true. But it's a great question. He wasn't really concerned with questions of sourcing materials. He seemed to take that more or less for granted. But it's a great point. I mean, you know, what one might also say, was he concerned with the source of clean water? And I think he was interested in keeping streams and rivers clean. So that's another part of the kind of supply chain issue. Yeah, please.
Yeah, it's also true that some of the coal, particularly the coal extraction in the north, was above ground. It was and this occasioned Ruskin buying in some cases, you know, 100 acres of virgin forest to prevent locals from industrializing that area and preventing you know, this kind of I'm not quite sure what the technology was, but it was above ground coal extraction.
Open-faced
Yeah,
coal.
open-faced, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great question. Thank you. Yes, please.
Does it seem at times like he's the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, trying to hold back industrialization? And I mean, obviously, it somewhat failed. But
Somewhat, yes. We can say that.
on the other hand, you look at Great Britain today and sustainability. I mean, they seem to be, you know, at the forefront of sustainability along with a couple other countries. It's really top of their mind. So maybe he was just ahead of his time.
And I think ideologically he planted the seeds, and actually even institutionally. So I mean, certainly through William Morris, the influence on Morris, and then both of them were crucial to the founding of the National Trust, which began as an endeavor to preserve seashore and, you know, particular forms of endangered terrain in England. It then ended up more about architecture and propping up aristocratic stately homes, which I don't think Ruskin would have really intended for. And it's now veering back to its roots and being more ecologically, you know, interventionist and sort of. So I think the preservation movements, both of historic structures but also of land, really do owe a tremendous amount to Ruskin, and that seed was planted. And it, you know, it continued all through the 20th century. So there was never a moment when that endeavor was abandoned, which is probably why it is indeed very powerful now. It's also, of course, the case that if you look at the percentage of land that was covered by industrialization in the UK, it's huge compared to anywhere else, because it's a small place with a lot of people and a lot of industry. Whereas, you know, the United States has massive industrial cities, but as a sort of percentage of the total land mass, that they're nowhere near as big. I mean, you can get from Leeds to Bradford to Manchester in an hour on the train. So you can see this huge conurbation, which was already there in Ruskin's time. And I mean, the other thing which we discussed at lunchtime, of course, was his acute sensibility to environmental change because of industrialization, you know, the storm cloud of the 19th century. So, I mean, in so many ways, he was ahead of the curve, even as he was giving this kind of medievalist, unrealistic politics. With it came a kind of really profound ecological critique. And I suspect that it's not right to say that the medievalism is just nonsense, the eco stuff is the real Ruskin, because actually it was precisely a vision of an unspoiled England that served as the comparison against which industrialization was to be damned.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying today with a session with the students, that whereas the agricultural schemes of the Guild of St. George in 1871 seem comical.
Yeah.
You know, these various groups trying to do natural farming and failing after a couple of years, and all those failed attempts to farm. Now all that land, which is owned by the Guild, has become, you know, pace-setting environmental farming and development. So that vision that Ruskin had in 1871, in a way, is only now, you know, coming to fruition. Even in Bewdley, for example, Ruskin land. Yeah. Bewdley is a kind of depressed area, and there's a lot of unemployment. And when they began to thin the forest, the ancient forest that Ruskin purchased so many years ago, began to really think about how to use it and develop it in a proper way. They were able to employ many of these unemployed people in Bewdley, and they were able to start various agricultural industries and bee collecting and so forth, all sorts of things that they were able to develop that, again, none of that succeeded under Ruskin's impossible sort of, or he had no organizational sense. None of it's worked during Ruskin's time, but he's working now.
Yeah. Actually, I'd like to ask our urban historian, since we have one, was this unique, or were there land schemes like this in any of your, because you studied so many industrial cities?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that what I found in my research is that lots of people were inspired by Ruskin to do, I mean, so a lot of things that became, my name's Amy, by the way. I'm a professor of history at Loyola Marymount University. And I mean, even when Ruskin wasn't directly involved, he inspired all of these different schemes. So a lot of times the people in city councils who were saying, we really need parks, or we're going to set up a scheme to take the workers out to the countryside, or we should be planting trees. They were all Ruskinians, you know, they were like literally writing him letters and saying like, what should I do for my city? Or they were founding art galleries, or so, you know, it just went everywhere. And I mean, sometimes they depended on some rich patron who was like a local industrialist to give them the money to, you know, build the park or buy the land. And that's like the problem of capitalism, right? Is that you can have a bunch of good do-gooders in a room, and then they're like, where do we get the money? Oh, we're going to need the industrialist who is the reason that we need the thing, right? And that's so, you know, you get into a kind of
guilty as charged. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Pays my salary. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Regarding Sheffield and Ruskin's work presence there, could you talk a little bit about the workers themselves, particularly inside that enormous cyclops? Was it able to manifest itself and sort of produce some move towards rights or something else?
Well, I did so, but only in the most violent way, because essentially, as Engels said, there was a class war in Sheffield. So there was tremendous violence between, I mean, both within the working class movement, those within unions and those outside them. So there was a real struggle there, and then between there were a lot of lockout. Foot rate was down, heat rate is down. Was closed for a long period until starvation set in, and then they would open. You know, it was really rough. And the small scale little mesters in these little workshops making the blades had a much more sort of organic, apprenticeship model. than the wage labor, if we need more products, we hire more people, and if we need less, we just fire them. That kind of model of the camel works. So I think the answer is it was a kind of classic, it was rather like Pittsburgh or somewhere else, a classic steel industry situation where increasingly large amounts of unskilled labor were brought in, resisted by skilled labor. So there was a tension within the working community, and then profits are everything. So the sort of the trade cycles would cause moments of exuberance and moments of tremendous hardship for the laboring population. Yeah.
If you may, I was curious about any of the political avenues that Ruskin may have undertaken, because a lot of the talks we have, even I was at the student luncheon, the impression I get of Ruskin is someone who is very keen on the war of aesthetics against capitalist structures, and these things which dehumanize and take away human dignity.
Right.
Because if I were to read The Stones of Venice, I would probably read it on my phone.
Yes.
And I would turn off my phone when that thing comes up.
Yeah.
And think there is cobalt and lithium in here.
That's right.
That was mined. So going back to the question of the miners, mined very probably inhumanely in Africa. And obviously, I'm sure Ruskin would not like that. Aesthetically, he would hate that. But did he have any political activities to kind of match?
No, it's a great question, and that the difference between Ruskin and his student disciple William Morris is that Morris decided only after a long time, I mean, in middle age, decided that it's no good just saying it. You have to do it, and became an actual revolutionary socialist, and was arrested and all the rest of it. I mean, Ruskin simply wasn't. He didn't really believe in politics at all. He certainly didn't believe in party politics. So he, in a way, his analysis was at a remove, which simply took him out of the business of organizing things. And certainly a valid critique. Although, as we've been saying, in a strange way, his effect has been long after his death in some key issues. And we talked about Gandhi, and there's all sorts of places in the world where Ruskin's texts did affect action when other people took it. But the one thing he was not going to do was saying, okay, vote for Ruskin and I will be your MP and I will bring in new legislation to get a new road made for you. In fact, the one occasion when he did try to do something practical, it was a complete disaster. Well, the land scheme was also a bit of a disaster, but he wasn't really running that himself. But he did actually take a group of undergraduates in their white linen outfits from Oxford, including Oscar Wilde and Arnold Toynbee. And he said, right, this is enough talk. Let's go and make a road. And they went off and they started, I had no idea. And there's a hilarious illustration from one of the magazines of the local people standing around watching this bizarre performance of all these, willowy young men in their white linen trying to make a road. As Oscar Wilde said, it was like a bad lecture. It just ended up in a bog and stopped. And so, Ruskin was not the practical man. He wasn't Lenin. Something must be done, right? He was completely different. But, we have to say, it strangely, precisely because of the aesthetics, he could reach places in bourgeois societies and globally that perhaps if he'd just written Das Kapital is not so much fun to read as Stones of Venice, and it just has a different impact. It's a great question, and he's guilty as charged.
I would love to know when was with the.
It's in my book. You can Google it. It was when he was giving the Slade lectures.
Yeah, the
Hinksey Ferry Hinksey Road. It was
exactly
70 something, 1877.
It's hilarious because the intuition I think learning about his life is of course he would be terrible at this, and it's sort of operating from that remove, that enormous wealth affords a person to act as an intellectual with his money in sort of these truly ideologically ways, and it's fascinating to hear about the outcome of like him just buying up all this land and saying to just arrest the progress and we'll deal with it later.
Right.
I mean, that is a practical lesson from some forms of Marxism. And I'm reminded even from earlier, though I don't know how directly to speak to it, but I've read a lot of like late correspondence between Walter Benjamin and Theodore Adorno, where, you know, Adorno's rigorous, both like disciplinary to the tradition of Marxism is clashing with Benjamin's sort of theological approach and our historical approach to seeing life. And it, I bring that up because it's despite his taste, Ruskin's taste. One of the things that really stood out to me was the way you described his curation, his method of curation in the House Museum. And I'm most reminded of descriptions of Diana Vreeland's direction of the Met Costume Institute, where she, and of course it's like we're deep into the commodity, so deep by then, but driven by things like color and things like, and narratives that speak to, you know, far beyond disciplinary questions or questions of history. And it's like, I'm not a historian per se, so it's like reading Ruskin today, I have to, for myself, combine it with an art history that speaks more to my experience of like life so far removed from these many industrial revolutions.
Right.
But I'm curious if like that resonance speaks to you at all.
Well, I mean, there's lots in what you said. Very interesting. I mean, there's the question of Ruskin's own wealth, which he really did spend. So he ended up with very little money at the end. He gave it away, nearly all of it, for philanthropic purposes, and he used a lot of it to commission works of art particularly from female artists, which is quite a part of it that's not been, you know, written about as much as it might. So he did recognize his own privilege, but he did also spend it down. So there's that. I mean, I think the kind of the use of curation as a kind of art making, a sort of formal expression of aesthetic taste, is a really, really interesting one. And art history as a discipline doesn't like that. You know, it's too loosey-goosey. So the Adorno system building tendency would not want art history to include an element of simply formal matching to teach through looking. But, you know, Ruskin is always there to remind us that actually is a very valuable thing to do. So I think that's great. I mean, I would love to know more, and I've always meant to look into it, the extent to which Walter Benjamin was influenced by was reading Ruskin. Yeah, go.
Just off of that, actually, my thoughts. I'm interested in Ruskin's influence on literature.
Oh yeah.
Spent a lot of time studying, and so Ruskin's elements of drawing and that. So I'm yeah, it's interesting to know about this project in Sheffield. We're seeing that through the lens of sort of educational teaching to see, not only sort of teaching, you know, the worker to see, but like this project of emphasizing like the capacity of the worker to see or something.
Yes.
And I was also interested in that point you made of like that it was important where the museum was,
Yes.
if I understood correctly, so that it gave this particular view of the city. So just interested in, if you could speak more about this project as a part of that larger project of teaching to see, and also just out of curiosity if there were drawing classes like
yes, great question. Yes, so the question of art education is another one where Ruskin versus Henry Cole and the official government systems were absolutely at odds with each other. So Ruskin, his art education was mainly done in London at the Working Men's College, but he did lay down his principles of art education in various public publications. But the Elements of Drawing, 1859, is a key one. And again, it was, Henry Cole and the government schools of design had a curriculum which was meant to produce effective industrial designers. So a lot of it was about skills in machine drawing and the kinds of transferable skills that would be useful in a workplace. And Ruskin's point about the working men's college was that these people have been at work all day, and this is the not work, or not that kind of work, not the drudgery. This is a kind of labor, for example, drawing from natural objects like pine cones and pieces of living wood that was a way of drawing out a different side of a person. So he says, I'm not so interested in creating artists as creating carpenters who are at peace with themselves and with the world. So it's a very different approach to is art education instrumental towards an economic goal, or is it, as it were, worth doing in its own right? And Ruskin says the latter. John Berger is, for those of you who are not familiar with this, you should definitely go on YouTube and watch 71 black and white BBC TV series called Ways of Seeing, which was constantly broadcast on Sunday afternoons when I was a kid. It was a sort of foundational moment in what we now think of as the social history of art, i.e. relating art to the economic and political context that made it, which sounds so obvious now, but the previous sort of television program, Kenneth Clark's Civilization, 1969, was just a celebration of the beauty of various styles in many ways. So Berger was a much more critical Marxist approach. Was John Ruskin the inventor of the social history of art in the Stones of Venice? And is Berger a Ruskinian? I think he would have hated that idea probably, but I think he was actually.
Sorry, just to jump in
yeah.
too,
Tell
because
me,
I'm really excited. And I went to earlier text, Permanent Red.
Oh yeah.
If people are interested, that's his collection of art critical essays from the New Statesman, and
Yes.
that I think it's very Ruskinian.
Yes, I agree. And then after Berger made that intervention, another generation of critics came in, Peter Fuller, who started a magazine called Modern Painters, which took the nostalgic pastoral Ruskin, but sort of abandoned the hard-edged social critique. So it was sort of interesting double act between the two of them. But Berger has had a much longer standing influence, I think. It's a great question though, and isn't it amazing that in 1970 or 2025 we're still thinking about works of criticism that were written in 1843 by a guy who'd never been to Paris, didn't know anything about the history of art really, and you couldn't study it. So Ruskin kind of invented the discipline in his own quixotic image, because there really is no English language art history much before him. There's lives of the artists of various kinds, but not art history. So, in a way, our whole discipline in the English language comes down to this guy being annoyed that someone wrote a bad review about them, and then creating this whole edifice of thought out of that thing. And thank goodness he did. Jenna, hi.
Going back to the ecological question of his project of buying up these parcels of land to kind of preserve them, do you see any connection there with the national parks in the Midwest? And I'm thinking about Thomas Moran. It's reading Ruskin, being hugely influenced by him, going out west, and his watercolors being used as a kind of justification for the creation of Yellowstone National Park.
I think it's absolutely right. Shannon is an expert on Thomas Moran and Mary Newman and curator of American art at the Los Angeles County Museum. Thank you for coming. And I think there is a direct line. In fact, what's interesting is that there are many lines from Ruskin into American art in different generations, because there's also the Charles Eliot Norton and art education at Harvard. There's the American pre-Raphaelites of the 1860s during the Civil War. And I think, if you were to look at even in the early 20th century, the kinds of museum donations that follow Ruskinian taste so much. Isabella Stewart Gardner, keen reader of Ruskin. Look at the architecture of the museum in Boston. It's the plates from Stones of Venice turned into a museum. So I think there's a really strong Ruskinian element in not so much in the classroom, which in America art history is strongly German influence, especially after the 1930s, but in the patronage of art, collecting of art. I mean, I think Bernard Berenson, who was a key advisor to so many collectors, especially Stuart Gardner, also, I mean, the way Berenson writes is deeply Ruskin. Even if some of his techniques were more scientific connoisseurship, his eloquence about the Renaissance comes from Ruskin. So I think actually wherever you look, you see him in art history, but also in ecological politics, and then relationship between art and nature. I think that's absolutely right.
I represent the estate of Khalil Gibran, who wrote The Prophet, as well as his godson who inherited that estate. And his widow survives him. And she told me about her father, who was the head of the union, Teamsters Union in Eastern Massachusetts, who, when she came to his deathbed, found Ruskin on the mantel.
No more need be said. I think it's really fascinating. I mean, Ruskin was also the key reading for the members of the 1945 Labour government in Britain that set up the welfare state. It's interesting, they weren't reading Das Kapital, they were reading Unto This Last. Nye Bevan, the founder of the NHS, was a keen Ruskinian. And so that moment of kind of liberatory socialism, which wasn't really Ruskin's thing because it was organized and it was kind of institutional. Nonetheless, the sort of underlying ethics of it came from a local source, not from a kind of international Marxist thinking. Especially after the war, I think the labor movement was very, reluctant to sign up to anything international. It was a kind of moment of, insularity in art making anymore. John Piper, and also in politics, and that's where Ruskin really came through. So I mean, I think strangely enough, the welfare state, with all its rules and regulations, actually does owe a lot to, there is no wealth but life, which is why you have to keep people alive with the National Health Service in 1948. And I really do think it's very strong influence. I'm getting a warning that time is up. I could take one more question if anyone has one. I think, thank you very much for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Well, we are delighted that we were able to arrange this trip to the West Coast. So